Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller, where for 6 years and 450 plus episodes, we have had the distinct privilege of interviewing and conversing with some of the world's most iconic authors, successful entrepreneurs, people that have had high highs and low lows professionally, personally. We talk about marketing, culture, leadership, strategy, innovation, creativity, artistry. We interview creators from all facets of the world. Franklin Covey, of course, is the most trusted leadership firm in the world, founded 4+ decades ago, in part by Stephen Covey, who, of course, wrote the seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this podcast is designed to invest in millions of listeners and viewers twice weekly to make you a better leader, formally or informally, regardless of what your role is, and including roles you may have in your personal life. We like to help ignite the genius in other people and inspire them to greatness. Our guest today is James Rhee. He is a teacher, professor. He is a business leader. He is a parent. He's a son. He's a spouse. He is an author. He's an inspirer. He is a creator. He geniusly wrote this book called Red Helicopter, that quite frankly has gotten a bit of a cult following around it. Red Helicopter, lead change with kindness plus a little math. James, welcome to On Leadership.
Thank you very much for having me. That was a really warm and insightful intro, so thank you.
James, we're going to learn a lot about your history, a little unconventional, a little unexpected, certainly well-deserved because of what you've learned. For many years, you served as the CEO of an apparel company, Ashley Stewart, known to many as plus-size clothing for women of color. A little unconventional to have someone like you run that company, but you should talk about all the lessons that you've learned. The story of a red helicopter actually comes from a remarkable experience early in your life as a young boy. Before we talk about the significance of why Red Helicopter, would you rewind a little bit? You have a well-deserved and well-earned reputation. You've worked hard for your education and for your career, for your successes. Would you just indulge me and rewind a couple of decades ago? Talk about your upbringing, your academic history. Don't gloss over that, please, and your professional history, and then we'll dive into some insights and learnings from the book, Red Helicopter.
Sure. Son of Korean immigrants, first in the U.S., first native English speaker. So systems explorer, systems explainer from the get-go. Parents were both caregivers, pediatrician and nurse. We were taught to give care to people. That was just how we were raised. Public school beneficiary, thank you all taxpayers on Long Island. And then went to Harvard College, Harvard Law School, which were sort of the first brands I ever had adorned next to me. Studied people. I was basically a politics, philosophy, economics major, 19th century at Harvard, and then went to law school not to be a corporate attorney, but really to understand legal systems and understand sort of why people behave the way they do. And so that is my sort of academic background. When you put it all in a blender, I am a studier of people and about trying to understand why they make decisions the way they do and why we design systems the way we do, and how sometimes, agency and mutualism go hand in hand, and sometimes when they don't go so well hand in hand. And so that's my background.
Talk a little bit about professionally, because you took a little bit of a unconventional twist before you went to Harvard Law School, and then what you did after there as well. Talk about your role as an educator, what you did prior to Harvard Law School, and then what you've been doing professionally since then.
Yeah, first job at a college, I taught high school for $12,600 a year. It's been a pattern. I learned something that is sort of presented overly complex, and I simplify it. I try to figure out how to communicate that to any and all. I think that's one of the big failings in our systems, is just the lack of democratization of knowledge. And after law school, it's just buried under a bunch of school debt. I realized I didn't have any money, and I didn't know how money worked, so I busted my way into sort of the upper echelons of private equity, which was a very nascent industry back then. And I managed or help manage billions of dollars of money. I've owned a lot of the most iconic brands in the United States. It tended to be consumer retail and people-intensive businesses, which makes sense because those businesses, there's both a rational and irrational about why there is affection toward a brand, why people behave a certain way. And yeah, so I learned money in that way. And then, as you alluded to, I became an unlikely CEO in my 40s because at that point in time, I thought that it was time for me to apply a lot of the different systems learnings that I had required on behalf of a group of women that reminded me an awful lot of my mother, like very worthy, very deserving, wanting agency, but perhaps struggling in a series of systems that made them feel less than.
James, during your corporate career as a CEO of a clothing company, you wrote this book called Red Helicopter. I'll mention it again. The tagline is "Lead change with kindness plus a little math." At the top of the cover of the book, it says a parable for our times. And I kind of struggled with understanding that because in some ways this book is a memoir of your life that anyone can relate to regardless of their background, their heritage, their stature, their economic or academic trials or successes. It is a leadership book. It is a business book. It is a relationship book. It's a book about legacy and impact and reputation and ethics and triumph and failure. It's a book about perseverance, long-term thinking. But you also call it a parable. Would you just re-educate me and educate our audience on, it is all those things, a nonfiction business leadership life book, but it's also a parable. It's written in an extraordinarily unique style. I've read a few books, 1,000 books, read a few thousand books in my career. And I've not read a book quite like this, the way in which it's organized. Riff on that for a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. You have to pick. I think that the book is a parable because in many ways that cafeteria in which I present myself as a first-time CEO, twice bankrupt business, about to be liquidated. You got this first-time CEO, private equity guy, Korean American guy, standing in there in chaos with the systems collapsing upon this company, and it's predominantly a black woman's company. It was chaos. And I think in many ways, that situation is a situation that fast forward 10, 11 years, many people in the world feel like they're living in that type of chaos now. I think in a lot of ways we were perhaps prescient about some of the strains and sort of disbelief that many of us are trying to operate our lives and business under right now. It was chaos, and I think that the world in which we're living right now, it is anything but stable. So that's why the parable. It was a time when a lot of the things that I thought were the answers, that I had the truth, I really had to dig deep and say, are the things that I learned and held as conventions and as facts, are they really true? And that's why in that moment of chaos, the things that came out of my mouth from a very intuitive sense and a very human sense were the words kindness and math, because I wanted to start on a brand new foundation of truth. And to me, kindness and math, that pursuit, ultimately what I was saying was, let's just get to truth and let's debunk a lot of historic conventions because the future will be anything but conventional. So that's why that's what that is. And the book, the way it's organized, I guess deep down, I am a musician. I'm high in musicality. I'm not a professional musician, though I am a musician. There's a lot of professional musicians in my family, and I've realized that the way that I perceive and take in data and then reinterpret them and express them, I've always done it more as a musician. Music is just sound waves and math. And that's how I sort of organize my thoughts, is how do you compose a symphony, a serenade, a anthem that people can really listen to. And most people will not listen to a monotonous, single beat, single tone piece of music. And in order to teach sometimes, it's incumbent upon a leader to compose a narrative, compose a symphony that has the ebbs and flows, the emotionality, that keeps people attention and also allows them to sort of foreshadow about what's to come, so that you're not dictating the future, you're creating a common rhythm and a common piece of music that people can lead in their own way and riff and play much like a jazz musician would play.
James, I want to get to the story about the red helicopter and the significance in one moment. But first, this book is an interplay of personal and professional insights, triumphs, setbacks, experiences. Would you first reintroduce everybody to Ashley Stewart? Not everyone may know what that company has been through, what their customer, what their product is like. Give us just a quick overview of Ashley Stewart.
Yeah, in 2013, when I really became the interim CEO for 6 months, ended up being 7 years because there weren't a whole lot of people willing to bet on the women or me or the combination of both. At that time in 2013, it was a 22-year failed company on business metrics, but it was not a failure in its community. On the surface, it sold fashion to size 12 and up Black women in neighborhoods across the United States. But in reality, I don't think that's what they sold. They sold a sense of community, a safe place for a group of women that do a lot in their communities and are oftentimes not rewarded or recognized for it. So the real product, the capital P, was the best in humanity. And I think the lowercase p, the way that it manifested and tried to be in business as a for-profit entity, was to sell clothes. So that's what Ashley Stewart was. And I think one of the things that I saw in the business that it was hard for me to get people to see it was that the capital P product, the humanity and what it stood for, what the real product was anything but clothes.
James, I'm going to make a connection here. Last week, I had the privilege of interviewing Malcolm Gladwell for the second time, his new book out, The Revenge at the Tipping Point. And one of the phrases he has kind of coined is the overstory. Like every crisis, every pandemic, every success, every failure, every story has an overstory. And you've just demonstrated something quite remarkable there as the former CEO and non-executive chairman, I think at the time, where you talked about the real business that you were in. It was a failure by business metrics. It was not a failure by other metrics that were vital to the mission, the impact of the company. I think every CEO, every founder can benefit from reconnecting to maybe what is their overstory, what is their real purpose. Obviously, no margin, no mission. But talk about how that has been a guiding principle in your leadership career about understanding, the math, but also standing the real business that you're also in. Just kind of re-dip us into that. Everybody can benefit from re-engaging there.
Sure, I think it's a lesson that many of us learn way too late, oftentimes on our deathbed, but the overstory of work, of your existence, is your life. It's your mental, emotional health, it's your relationships, it's your legacy, it's your family, it's just life. And I think we forget that. And we try to create binary systems where there's a life and that there's work. And increasingly, because of tech, I think that many of us are conflating life with work. And so I've never understood that. Like for me, whenever I take personality tests early on, the general result is that I am the same person. Whether you like me or not, same person whether or not I'm at work, I'm at home, I'm volunteering, I'm playing tennis. It's just the same James. I've tried to keep the same norms and tried to aspire to be the person that I was raised to be. And I tried to treat people first and foremost as humans in whatever context they're in. So the overstory for me is just humanity, it's life. And I don't think that a work environment, no matter what the legal regimes say or statutes say or norms, I don't think work should give you the excuse or the cover to be anything less than human to the people with whom you work.
James, I'm going to ask you to indulge me and take that one step further, because I'd like you to take the moment and just remind every leader, founder, creator, sales leader, chief revenue officer, chief financial officer, to take the time and revisit, like, what's the real business we're in, right? I mean, what are some of the lessons you learned from the company, Ashley Stewart, around how understanding the impact you were having helped this company survive and thrive in times of financial difficulty? Huge.
Yeah, we were 6 weeks away from liquidation. I think the most important thing that I said, it was less what I said, it was actually how I showed up, right? It was people talk a lot, but I showed up every day, flew down. Obviously, I kind of ripped up my private equity Harvard life. I was interim CEO and then permanent CEO of a twice bankrupt business, serving and employing predominantly Black women. It wasn't a, quote, prestige job. And so the first thing was just being intrinsically motivated and saying, like, I see the greatness in this business. And it was also the way that I approached the problem. I really approached it as a learner. I admitted very early on to the women that worked at the company that on paper I was everything that they didn't need, that all the things that were on the checklist, that woman, fashionable, retail executive, I was none of those things, and I was sorry. But that the thing that I could give to them was that I cared, and that I was the only one who showed up enough to care, and that I asked them for their help. I asked them to tell me what they thought the problems were, and that I'd do my best to learn and figure out how to allow them to be successful on their terms. And that's the most important thing that I did in retrospect. It sounds very simple, but I think most of the book explores how simple can be incredibly hard and that we overthink sometimes.
James, tell the story of how this red helicopter came into your life. And if you'll tell it the same way you shared it in the book, because you talk about its significance, why you were given this red helicopter at kind of a little bit later. Walk us through that. It's a lovely story.
I think in moments of chaos and just generally, let's face it, life is generally chaos. It's important to have a belief system and a self-narrative that you really cling to, because, sadly, being bombarded with everything, the world also just tries to sort of sometimes pick at and take away your belief system. And for me, the red helicopter is my belief system. It was a simple story when I had courage and I had the sense of conviction and wisdom of a 5-year-old that I had a harder time clinging on to as I accumulated, quote, knowledge. So the story is very succinctly, I came back from kindergarten, public school, 1976, Long Island, with a toy red helicopter. And then there was a calamity of misunderstandings and false accusations of things that would have prevented me from understanding the wisdom of what I did. So my parents thought I stole it. They thought they had messed up because they thought that in America, people gave toys in public school at Christmas, and I kept explaining I'm the only one who got it. Then they got frustrated with me because I didn't know why this family had given me this toy red helicopter and me only. And then my dad, instead of just saying, oh, we found out and we realized you've been giving half your lunch to this boy who doesn't have food, he didn't say it that way. He kind of challenged me and sort of said, why are you giving half your sandwich away that your mother wakes up in the morning and makes you this perfect sandwich? And we were not in abundance financially mode in 1976. He's like, well, why are you giving your food away? And there were many reasons why I could have sort of halted and sort of changed my story. But I remember looking at my dad, which I rarely did, with my chin out and saying, my friend didn't have lunch. And why wouldn't I give him half my lunch? And my dad then explained that my friend's mother had died that summer and that the father had 4 kids under the age of 10, and that the father came in just to pat me on the head and to meet the boy who was doing this. And I remember feeling very just sad for my friend, obviously, but I described it as that warm, deep feeling in your chest. I felt like I had done something really good that was intrinsically good without expectation of reward. And I remember my dad being very emotional, which he rarely showed, because I'm sure as a dad now, he was thinking, wow, my 5-year-old boy, he doesn't know how to tie his shoes yet, but he lives his life with such abundance. And I've always wanted to be that boy. And I think sometimes as you get to be an adult and you accumulate things and rewards and external, medals and things, it's hard, ironically, to live that abundantly. And I think as a society, I'm asking people to reconsider.
You open the book telling this beautiful story of how every parent hopes their child arrives through the occasion. I saw a lot of my father in your father. Both of our fathers have since passed. It reminds me a lot about a book that was written by Bobby Herrera called The Gift of Struggle. different story, but kind of a similar outcome. You have written a lovely book that is a book that will shake people to their core on their reputation, their brand, how they treat people, what they're remembered for, their legacy, their contribution, how they see themselves in a larger system, a word you've used many times we're going to come back to. There was one kind of metaphor that you shared in the book that I'd like you, if you would, to expand on. You talk about a pine cone, and it has so many applications in our business, in our families, in our lives, in our careers. Will you take your time and talk about kind of the role of a pine cone and what happens to it in different scenarios, settings, and circumstances? Maybe tie it back to our lives.
Yeah, sure. There's a particular type of pine cone. It's colloquially referred to as a fire pine. And it looks, in real life, everyday life, it looks like a failure because seeds never come out of this particular pine cone. And the reason is that the seeds are encased in very thick wax. And so if you look at it just day to day, you say, oh, this pine cone, what a useless pine cone this is. But the fact is that when there's a forest fire, this pine cone is the ones that seed the new forest after everything gets incinerated because the wax melts slowly enough to protect the encased seeds. And that during trauma and during chaos and during times of massive inflection and change, it's these seemingly useless and, useless pine cones that are the ones that give life. And I think that's how I generally have tried to live my life as an investor, as a private equity investor. I'm a values investor, using both meanings of the word. I try to find brands and companies that are, quote, undervalued by everybody. That's the definition of arbitrage and alpha. And then as a human being, which is, again, what you were saying about the more important story, as a former high school teacher, as a current teacher, I think I've always been a teacher and a soccer coach, I like to see the value in people that others don't. And I think oftentimes it's hard. We gaslight ourselves, and people are burdened by all these words and how-to books that tell them why they're bad. And I tend to approach things and try to find the best in people and sort of bring that out and affirm that first and affirm that 10 times and say, no, this idiosyncrasy you have, it's awesome. It's what makes us human. Your life is not an algorithm. And I, for one, can see that value that you have, that difference. And I do think that's what kind environments create. It allows people to express that idiosyncrasy. And particularly in times of heightened change, it's idiosyncrasies that create new life and innovation in companies or also in lives or in countries.
James, again, I'm going to belabor this point because I think it's worth it, especially to me, kind of where I am in my own life, professionally and personally. I'm going to read from a passage. You write, when the heat of a forest melts the resin, the seeds are released. Ironically, the same gluey resin prevents these pine cones from seeding trees during normal times because their seeds are trapped and have no way out. So you see, in the same way, we've discovered that assets are sometimes liabilities. It works the other way around, too. Sometimes your greatest liability becomes an asset when you have the courage to view it from a different perspective, usually at an inflection point in your life. Yeah. A change in perspective costs $0. Remember how people drown in water, an element critical for sustaining life. Well, a near drowning experience can also create the opportunity to breathe again. I think that is profound. I told you off air, I think the best way to read this book, if someone were to ask me, read 3 or 4 pages, put it down, take a walk around the block, you'll burn a couple calories and you'll get deep wisdom from James. Would you expand on that? I want you to teach this lesson because I don't know anybody that isn't going through some inflection point in their life as a parent, their marriage, their career, their finances. Teach this lesson a little deeper, will you?
Sure. So first of all, given that many of the listeners here, we all work, and and I do a pretty good job eviscerating financial accounting in this book because, I say to the reader that remember, accounting is made up. It's just a convention. It forces you to pick a side, asset, liability. Our whole life, and this is the danger of groupthink, that we tend to sometimes view, quote, assets as what everyone else views as an asset. And it's one of the things that worries me increasingly about the future in terms of putting everything in binary terms, zeros and ones, and trying to get perfection and trying to perpetuate a certain set of algorithms. So in this book, I'm just saying to people that people are very different, and to not succumb to groupthink, and to create your own fluid balance sheet, and to realize that putting names on things, that this is an asset, this is a liability, this is black, this is white, this is this party, this is that party, that I think it's actually counter-effective, that particularly in times of innovation and change, that most of nature is fluid, and that it's not meant to be in binary systems. Most of nature is governed by the laws of entropy, and it's sort of a oneness. It's really a book that is asking people to really think before putting labels on things, particularly on yourself. And that's the thing that I discovered the most in my 40s. This experience, the heat from my experience melted all of the armor, false ego. There's a lot of ego death in this book. And it really made me fight to figure out the truth of me, and to realize that a lot of the sort of sadness and oddness in my upbringing, which we all have, that instead of being embarrassed by them or sort of viewing them as weakness, they provided a real source of strength for me and a point of differentiation, and ultimately in time for me to bury both my parents, knowing that some of the struggles that they went through and some of the things that were embarrassing or idiosyncratic as a kid, I don't think I could have done any of the things that I had done without those things. And luckily I realized that before they both passed away.
James, there is some weight as a podcast host to decide how you choose to spend your 30 minutes or so with an author and a creator like yourself. You write a lot in this book about patterns and pattern recognition. You've talked today several times about the value of understanding systems and how to create them, how to understand them, how to make them work in your life. Talk a little bit about systems, because that's not a word that a lot of people use personally. Professionally, we have systems and structures and strategies in our organizations, but I don't think that's a term colloquially most of us use throughout our lives and our personal lives, which is the majority of our life, hopefully. Yeah. What do you know about systems? What would you like our listeners and viewers to maybe think differently about the systems, and for that matter, even patterns in our lives?
Sure. It's so on the one hand, I spent some time teaching at MIT, where there is a school of thinking called systems dynamics that was invented at MIT. And at Howard, the class that I teach, and where I spend most of my time teaching these days, is called the Systems of Life, Money, and Joy. And so we don't teach on a systems basis. We could. Children generally think in these terms, and adults, we think less in these terms. We think more linearly. It's a way of trying to get people to understand why they make the decisions they make, and how to make better decisions for themselves, their loved ones, and the communities in which they are part. So at Howard, the first class that I teach is just systems of your brain, and how your brain works. And that's science. And then there's also systems of philosophy and systems of thinking, which all evolved before there was brain science. And then I teach the systems of how money is organized, systems of law, systems of society. These are all rules that have been put in place, sometimes statutory, sometimes common law, and sometimes just convention over time. And civilizations, like companies, sometimes outgrow their, the exoskeleton, endoskeleton that they have. And so I encourage people to think in correlations, right? To understand that a decision you make, sometimes trying to get from A to B, the way to solve the problem is not linear. In fact, by kicking at E and then like tweaking G, that is a more sustainable and easier way sometimes to get from point A to point B. And that type of thinking requires a certain sort of Zen-like perhaps, but it also requires understanding statistics. And so that's what systems dynamics is. It's understanding that most things, you have more than two factors in any problem solving, whether it's in your personal life or your business life, is to try to understand the totality of the ecosystem in which you're living in. And I think, frankly, we're not doing a great job preparing young humans, meaning like high school and college level, to understand the basic of the environment in which they're trying to make decisions. I think we can do a better job.
James, I'm going to take the final minute. I'm going to share with you and our listeners and viewers what I learned from your book. I'm still thinking about what is the red helicopter in my life? Was there one? Does there need to be one? Was it a thing or a how or a what or a who? And you actually can ask some of those questions, right, in the book as well. Your content has become quite ubiquitous between your TED Talk and your Dare to Lead interview with Brené Brown, amongst many other people that have shined a light on your work. When I read this book, and I will probably reread it, which is very rare for me, I don't have the time to reread books, but I will because I started thinking about, what are the patterns in my life that I have created or I've fallen into? How are they working for or against me? How am I repeating them healthily or unhealthily? I've thought about the systems and how I am or am not aware of how I'm either aligning with or kind of breaking against certain systems, and which of those are based in principles and which of those systems don't need to apply to my life, or I need to genuflect, to use a Catholic term, to.
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about the shortcuts that I've taken in life, and I've tried to minimize or disguise or not be accountable to. When have I, you've done it right. I'm sure you've made lots of mistakes, but you have a long-term view. You have learned to think long-term in a short-term world. You've learned to elevate the things that I think have gravity and maybe swat away the things that are less significant and distracting. I think your book is a great human manual. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The title again is Red Helicopter, Lead Change with Kindness, plus a little math, a parable for our times. James Rhee, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Delighted to have you here. Highly recommend Red Helicopter. And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.